Zadie must be amazing competing with family football games. So thank you all for coming. I want to thank you for being here. I'm Ayanna Thompson, the director of the Arizona Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies. And as a research center within the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, it is our mission to study the pre-modern past to imagine different, more inclusive futures. It's our great luck that tonight we have Zadie Smith to help us imagine, explore, and create these new futures. Zadie Smith is the author of many best-selling books, including White Teeth, On Beauty, Swing Time, and Grand Union. Her most recent book, Intimations, was written in the early months of the lockdown in 2020. Time magazine said, "This slim collection of essays captures this peculiar moment with startling clarity. The personal and political intermingle for a powerful indictment of America's social systems." In addition, her new play, The Wife of Willesden, is a 21st century translation of The Wife of Bath's Tale. And I know the medievalists in the audience will be eager to hear more about this one, as am I. Zadie is a force of nature, a powerhouse of inquiry. Her writing is insightful, emotional, and hilarious. The New York Times has very rightly deemed her one of the generation's most vital literary voices, and we're so thrilled to welcome her back to ASU. And Ruben Espinosa, who will be in conversation with Zadie Smith tonight, is the Associate Director for the Arizona Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies. Ruben is an accomplished scholar of Shakespeare and race, and is the author of many important books, including Shakespeare on the Shades of Racism. A couple of housekeeping notes. After their conversation, there will be a short Q&A followed by a book signing out in the rotunda. We ask that during the entirety of the event and the book signing, that everyone keeps their face covers on. And if you enjoy this event and want to learn more about our future events, please join our mailing list by signing up at the registration table or on our website, which is acmrs.asu.edu. Please help me give a warm welcome to Zadie Smith and Ruben Espinosa.
Thank you so much, Ayanna, and thank you all for being out tonight, and most of all, thank you, Zadie, for joining us here.
Thank you.
I'm thrilled. I took this job, and yeah, the perks are endless. So I'm really thrilled to be in conversation with you. So I think, like most people, you might be wondering what a center focused on medieval and Renaissance studies has to do with somebody like Zadie Smith, and I guess my short answer would be I want to say, like, who cares, right? We get to talk with Zadie Smith, but as Ayanna mentioned, she has a play that's going to debut next week, actually, The Wife of Willesden, and was just published in the UK, and so you can order your copies now. And as an entry point to this, I'll say while the center is invested in thinking about pre-modern history, literature, and culture, we are also very excited in thinking about the way that contemporary thinkers and writers and artists are engaging the works of the past. And so my first question is if you can reflect a bit and like what pulled you to Chaucer? What pulled you to The Wife of Bath?
Well, I have to give you a very unacademic answer to begin with, because it was an accident. And in London, they have this thing called the Borough of Culture, where all the boroughs compete to be the Borough of Culture. I'm from a place called Brent, which is a bit like, if you know New York, I guess it's like Queens. It's like a kind of lots of immigration from everywhere, old neighborhood of London. And they asked me to be part of this bid. And I said yes, thinking that we would never win, right? Because why would we win? And then I said yes, and we won. And so then they started hassling me about producing something for this Borough of Culture. And I was, busy and teaching and trying to write. I've got kids, and this went on. And then I was in my New York office, like in office hours, when one student's just left, and they phoned me again. I'm like, what about this Borough of Culture business? And I looked up on the shelf and I saw the Canterbury Tales, and I was like, okay. And I live in a place called Brondesbury, which is part of Brent, and I thought, maybe the Brondesbury Tales. I said, maybe I'll translate a little tiny bit and we'll put it in the local magazine. And they were like, that sounds fine. I was like, let's do that. And I didn't think about it for a while. And then I was looking through the Canterbury Tales, and as a student, anyone who goes to British University when I went would have done it for English, a year of medieval studies, which includes translation. So when I picked it up, I thought, oh God, it's really long. I'd forgotten how goddamn long it is. So I thought, let's scratch that. How about The Wife of Bath? Everyone loves The Wife of Bath. It's the rudest one, it's the funniest one. Cool. And then, so I thought, I'll just do a little bit, maybe one of the most rude parts, and they'll like that, and it'll be 2 pages, and I won't worry about it, a little bit of a monologue. And that's what I said to them. And then this is a long answer, I'm sorry, I will be done soon. Then I was getting on a plane to go to Australia for a book event. And because I don't have a smartphone, this woman phoned me again and said, I'm just going to let out a PR release about this thing. Do you want to read it? And I said, well, I can't, I'm getting on a plane, don't worry about it. I'm sure it's fine. Fine. Got on a plane. 24 hours later, in Australia, I opened my laptop, it was like 300 emails. I was like, what the? And it turned out, instead of monologue, she had said play. She said she's translating Wife of Bath, and I was like, well, that's hilarious. So I said to my agent, and everyone, it's not, obviously I'm not going to translate The Wife of Bath, that's insanity. And she said, well, it's all over Twitter, and everybody thinks you're doing it. And I was like, Twitter's going to make me write a medieval, what is happening right now? So that's how it came to pass. I was literally forced by Twitter to translate The Wife of Bath. And then, but the minute I started doing it, it was just joyful. I thought it was going to be a monologue because it is a monologue, but because she talks to so many people and talks about so many people, quite soon I started thinking, well, maybe I can parcel it out to other people. And then when you start translating the jobs, like a pardoner, I started thinking of like the Nigerian, mega preachers in my neighborhood. And so it all started becoming like a point for point. It became more and more interesting to me. And I kept the principle, like it's still rhyming couplets with soft rhymes in 10 syllable all the way down. And I felt, again, we're talking outside about kind of class allegiance with ancient writers. And in the English canon, both Chaucer and Shakespeare, for working class writers in Britain at least, there are brothers, because they speak about the people, they come from the people more or less. So it became a very easy transition. And the street that I'm writing about, the Kilburn High Road, which now is, it's a wild place and a very down at heel place, but it was a place of medieval pilgrimage once upon a time. So the translation started to come quite easily, and the more I did it, the more I enjoyed it. And it's a good example of how constriction can be creative, When you have no choice, sometimes interesting things happen.
I think the takeaway is that if you all want Zadie to write something, you should get on Twitter and get that going. That's a fantastic story. And so this is your first play, though, right?
It will be my last. I have no intention of being a playwright. But the funny thing about it was once I was in the room, it had been amusing to me to make, a charity figure in Chaucer, what we call in Britain a charity chugger, someone who stops on the street and tries to get money off you, or the preacher into Nigerian mega church, or Alison into Alvita, who's like a Jamaican woman in her late 50s. But to then see the actors, kind of to see the chaos I had created by accident, just amusing myself, I hadn't thought about it. And suddenly there's 10 actors who have to do fast changes and many different voices, and we have to go to Jamaica. I changed the King Arthur part to Jamaica in the 17th century. So all these things which had been amusing to me are, quite difficult to achieve on stage. So it was amazing to watch it happen, and the actors just take it away. It really is, it's their thing now.
Exciting, congratulations on that. Since you mentioned Shakespeare, you're a woman after my heart, right? I will be accused of making everything about Shakespeare. But I am curious, as you called him, your brother, and we were speaking a little bit about this outside. You have a great essay titled "Speaking in Tongues," and in it, you're thinking about the power of voice and the pressures of linguistic identity. And at one point, you reflect on Shakespeare to drive home your point, and I love that section as you're thinking about the power of his multiplicity. And I'll just read a kind of very short excerpt here where you say, "Our Shakespeare sees always both sides of a thing. He is black and white, male and female. He is every man." And then you go on to draw on Keats's idea of negative capability, and then on Stephen Greenblatt. And I like Keats, and I've studied Greenblatt, and I think I am more curious though to hear your thoughts on this multiplicity of voice that Shakespeare offers. Like, just maybe talk a little bit more about him being your brother. Like,
we talked a little bit outside. When you're in the faith of Shakespeare, you have the doubt that maybe any writer who was given the sign of absoluteness, of openness, you could find. Like, if we decided, for instance, Stephen King was the writer of absoluteness, maybe 400 years of scholars could go in and find everything they needed to find. It might just be that under the sign of openness, you find everything you need to find. That's like the non-believer part of it. And sometimes when I'm reading one of the really bad comedies, I think maybe that's what it is. But honestly, usually when I'm reading Shakespeare, I think, no, there is a reason for 400 years of close attention. This is a genius really without compare. As to the question of brotherhood, as we said outside, like, there's a lot in America, particularly at the level of class, which maybe is invisible to you in your racial agonistes, which dominates every conversation and everything in the world. But in England, Keats is a lower middle class boy, He's not like Byron, he's not an aristocrat. I did Keats when I was 15, and he was the only person in that GCSE who I felt any connection with, because we had a class connection. And again, in America, that all is obscured, right? There is only how you look. There is nothing to do with how you live, the circumstances of you live, the schools you go to, the healthcare you have. That all dies under this own final defining point. So Shakespeare, even more so, is the original autodidact. I used to think of him in the context of my mother, another autodidact in a completely different situation. That's an unusual thing in England, the writer who is not educated, not formally educated. So that always meant a lot to me when I was a kid.
Oh, I love that idea, and I think you're absolutely right. I think for most audiences in America, and certainly in high school coming to Keats, that there is a sense of only his Britishness, right? There isn't.
Right, they think he's posh, right? No, you're mistaken. You're mistaken about that. Yeah.
So maybe, if you don't mind, can you reflect on your experiences, first encountering this literature? I mean, are you made aware of
I can be very specific with Keats, because I went to again, something which is maybe unusual in England, which is a state school with no money that is entirely multiracial. And the professor, or the teacher who was teaching me, had been to Cambridge, which was incredibly unusual in those days. And the reason he'd come to my school is out of socialist principle, which was quite common in the 80s, that people who could do anything else really chose to teach in these schools on the principle that education is for everyone and the highest levels of education are for everyone. So this man, his name was Graham Walker, came to my school on socialist principle and taught us Keats in the GCSE section, and in every way made me feel that James Baldwin principle we were talking about, that this culture was mine as much as it was anybody's. And so that's how I learned Keats, in open and generous offering.
If you don't mind me asking, how old were you at that point?
14?
Wow, so very early on.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think about these experiences. I mean, I was recently, asked to reflect on my first coming to Shakespeare. And I think for the first time, as somebody in his 40s, I really had never given thought to how we come to literature here in the U.S. in particular, right? And for a young brown man, loving literature, like I watched a film like Dead Poets Society, right? And I could identify with the lust and the love of literature, but I really didn't interrogate the way that I was somehow identifying with these set of very privileged white kids, right, who are, supposed to be reflecting that literature themselves. And so I recognize that dynamic is different.
Yeah, we all thought that movie was hilarious. but I remember it. Yeah, absolutely. Those schools were as far away from us as the moon. Like, you couldn't even imagine. They look like little universities and everybody's in a suit. The idea of them. But I do remember, again, we were talking outside, the argument was entirely the other way around in the 80s. That's the point that I'm trying to get to, is that what we were trying to establish for all, and the school was mostly brown and black, is that this stuff was ours too. It was a completely different argument than you're having at the moment. So one of the things you have to do is have humility at the idea of intellectual fashions literally flipping every 30 years. You have to understand that happens. And the intellectual fashions 30 years before you will be incomprehensible. Like, you won't be able to understand them. But that was the case. In terms of black reading, I had that at home. Like, I wasn't in any shortage of black books. I got those from my mother. But the thing I was trying to insist upon in school was that these books belong to me too. This is world literature. It is mine. Don't try and stop me from reading these books. So that dynamic might seem as distant from you as the moon, but that was the context.
That's fantastic. I'm then wondering here, Zadie, so you moved to the U.S. and you began teaching at NYU, and how was that kind of cultural change? You talk about your children here also, maybe entering school. Do you see, in terms of the education system here, right, and your students, how they are coming to the literary canon? How are they?
Well, what I notice is that the arguments in the classroom were incredibly tense and stressful, and what I realize is because they only happen on a theoretical level. All these kids are in segregated schools. The black kids are in rich schools where they're the only black kid, and all the other kids are in segregated schools. So that was part of the reason the discussion is so heightened, because this is where it's happening. In my school, it was happening every day in every room, and we lived together. We were at school together. It was a different circumstance, and we had some concept of class solidarity. So that part is obviously different, but it's a deep difference in American life, a segregation that goes all the way down to the bone and has been legally defended and continues to exist, even though everybody pretends that it doesn't.
So now you're obviously thinking about this in your own writing. How, if you don't mind me asking, how do you bring this to the classroom? What are some techniques you use in terms of having your students?
I don't have any. I'm not an academic. I don't come to any class with a theory that is then applied to all texts. We read each book as it stands. We read The Bluest Eye considering Ohio, Toni Morrison, the history that is inside that book. We read Kafka thinking of Germany, the Jews in Prague. I read each book as it exists in its context, in its historical context, in the discussions we have in it, and of course with all the contemporary feelings we bring to it. But I do not have a policy I apply to the 14 books I teach, partly because they're from all over the world, they're from all over history. What policy could possibly apply to 14 novels of this variety? So I don't, I'm teaching as a writer, and more than anything, I'm teaching readers who want to be writers. So what we're dealing with more than anything is a sentence. Now, why a certain sentence is Kafka's, why a certain sentence is Baldwin's, why it's Toni Morrison's, how you can tell this is a Toni Morrison sentence. And it's not because of the things that are in it, like what happens, who the people are, it's because of the way she punctuates. I'm a technical person dealing with why are these writers writers of genius? And if the readers are interested in knowing, we can go through it. Historical, social, racial arguments are all part of that debate, but each book is its own wondrous thing that I am trying to communicate to readers and hear their experience, their existential experience of reading brought back to me. We have no general policy in my classroom, no.
So yeah, as an interested reader, like who are your writers of genius? Who are your go-to? Who do you?
They change. I teach The Bluest Eye every year just because it's so various, and also because it's my ideal in that it's short and a work of genius, which doesn't happen very often, which I absolutely adore when that happens. It changes. I teach Chinua Achebe, I teach Kafka, I teach Nabokov. Who do I teach? You know when your brain goes, Mural Spark. There's different things. I teach a thing about the Catholic novel, which interests me, which is a very British thing, but as opposed to the Protestant novel, which I guess is what I'm stuck in. So it depends. Year on year, certain books come in, come out, depending on what's interesting me. And I teach a lot of theory, like a lot of philosophy, from Kierkegaard to Derrida to Paul Gilroy, like things that interest me, theoretical ideas, yeah.
Right, which influences your current collection, right, or recently published Intimations. So I'm going to pivot a bit to that here, and something everybody can relate to, right? You know, so things begin to go down and lockdown, right, and the world kind of halts for an extended period of time. Like, what is your, you know, you speak about this a little bit, like your day-to-day can go on in terms of writing, but how is...
I was seriously bummed, dude. It was not good. No, it wasn't good. I didn't suddenly become a heroic person or develop a new activity, or no good things happened. I can't say anything good happened.
Oh, bread making for you?
There was nothing particularly positive about it, but in the depths, like I got very self-pitying and very depressed. I think a lot of people got like that. Not everyone. Some people were out on the streets doing amazing things, helping their neighbors. I didn't do any of that. I just lay in a dark room and was like, what has happened to my life? But when I got a bit, like, I thought I can't do this forever, and I was watching the news, and I think it was the feeling of non-utility, which I've always felt very strongly as a writer, which is partly the reason I teach, so I can feel like I'm doing something. But I felt it quite strongly, and I felt that I knew, like these days everybody, you know, they call themselves by various names. Lots of people call themselves activists, for example, but I have a great respect for what a real activist is, so I know I'm not one, and I know I'm not a person of action. I just can't seem to do things. So I thought, well, what can I do? I can write, okay. So I kind of focused on that narrow thing and thought, if I can, is it possible to publish a book quickly enough to make money for this situation? And so once I established that it was, because one thing which was good in lockdown is that publishing realized that you can just do everything much more quickly and virtually, and you don't actually need to be in a room discussing covers for 4 months. It's all nonsense. Like I found that cover on the internet in 5 minutes, emailed it to them, was like, yeah, let's do that. So it's not actually complicated. So that was good, and then I wanted to go to the Equal Justice Foundation and to COVID, because these were just the two things in my mind that particularly with a young family, you're inactive, right? Like your moral responsibility is to your family first and foremost, which makes you a bougie idiot because you can't go and do anything. So it was a way of relieving my conscience for sure, and of feeling active in some way.
We're lucky for it, right? Within it too, I mean, so on the one hand, you're talking about the pandemic, and I think somebody that most can relate to in terms of absolutely just, you know, falling into depression and thinking about what you're doing. But on the other hand, then you see, and you do discuss this in your beautiful concluding essay, and thinking about the events, you know, surrounding the murder of George Floyd, right?
Right.
Yeah, and so walk us through that. I mean, is that, you know, in terms of how are you reflecting on that as somebody, you know, here in the United States here, right, having lived here long enough to maybe understand the racist dynamics of this country, right, but maybe also thinking about possible experiences in the UK, differences, and the fact that it was a global response to this, I think, caught all of us off guard.
Yeah, it was incredible. I actually wrote that on a plane. I was flying out of America for the last time and watching the news. It was one of those planes where you can still watch the news. So it was a very visceral thing. I just couldn't take it for another second, basically. So it came out of that feeling of just you know, anger, and it was also, I mean, it's a twin essay. It's also about Brexit. It's really about power and manipulations of power, and the manipulation always in the direction of a certain subject. in the British version, the idea that the poor basically are always disposable, and in the American version, that the black man is always disposable. So I was just interested in that power relation and its persistence, and so I wrote that piece, yeah.
It's beautiful. Can I ask what you're working on now, or is that?
I'm going, well, actually not as far into the past as Chaucer, but I'm writing a novel set, it's a Victorian novel, but with the kind of constriction that it won't read like a Victorian novel, that's the best way I can put it. So it's a Victorian novel, but the chapters are short and delicate in a way that a lot of Victorian fiction, as much as I love it, is not like that. For reasons which are actually economic rather than aesthetic, to do with that 3-volume publication situation and the need to produce more and more words to keep the thing going. So it's a novel about... it's set in England and in Jamaica, and it's really interesting to write. It's really been amazing, actually. I kind of started it in the 2nd year of the pandemic. What has even happened to time? I don't know. It was my companion. You know, I grew up on the Victorian novel. Another brother, Mr. Dickens, another uneducated working class kid who comes out of nowhere. I mean, he's the biggest mystery in English literature. That really is weird. Like Shakespeare, you can assume there's something. Dickens goes from blacking hats to writing for Parliament like 4 years later, and then there's a novel, and there's no explanation at all of how that was managed. It's a love letter to all of that and the stuff I grew up with, and it's just interested in England's relationship with Jamaica, which is a deeply suppressed thing, you know. So for me, sometimes it's just about educating myself, things I would have liked to have known as a kid, which I was never taught. I now find out in late middle age, yeah.
And so what, speaking of that, like what drew you to this aside from?
It's always personal, I suppose. It's always about stitching up the two sides of my background into something that makes sense. And I was just interested in the complete... it's more than silence. It's really hard to explain the relationship between Jamaican slavery and England. It's like a lacuna. It's like a just total absence. It sits in the middle of the country, and it's also incredibly interesting. So for a lot of this has just been like doing a PhD on the side, right? It's just like reading endless books about 17th, 18th, 19th century Jamaica, because you have to keep going back to get the background of whatever you're doing. But it's fascinating. Yeah, I was just interested in, how do you put this? Like, you know, everybody knows the extremity of the guard in the Nazi camp or the overseer in the plantation. These are familiar things. But the thing we're always less eager to talk about, because it's totally implicating for all of us, not just the white guys, but everybody, is that what it takes to sit on top of suffering. Like at this very moment, there are Uyghur Muslims making H&M t-shirts for us, which I'm sure we all wear. So while obsessing about slavery, we allow this to happen right now, all of us, every day. While thinking about a distant slavery, we ignore a present slavery. So that's kind of what's interesting to me is, if you pathologize it, if you imagine that extreme things like slavery are only the product of lethal, essential race hate or whatever, then you get yourself off the hook, because you look at yourself and think, well, I don't have any lethal, essential race hate, so that seems fine. If you think rather that in all capitalist societies, it's incredibly easy to sit on suffering, to ignore it, to live within it, even as you're examining other suffering, that is far more implicating and far more worrying. And that's what interests me, how polite society deals with what seems unspeakable, unimaginable, but in fact is entirely integrated into your everyday life.
That's brilliant. I know we need to turn to audience questions relatively quickly. I do want to follow up because so much of this is focused on Jamaica. I heard you say in an interview that your first time going to Jamaica was an unpleasant experience. How has that relationship grown?
I think it was very common in my neighborhood for, kids to be dragged back to wherever they were from, Africa, Pakistan, Jamaica. It happened to us every summer, and we were all like, what? Because we were used to, our little suburb and our television and, whatever. And it was a shock, and particularly in my case, my family are not from, beach Jamaica. They're from, dirt, poor, red dust, inland Jamaica. So, I'm a teenager, and I wanted to be in London on the streets doing my thing. I didn't want to be in Jamaica. But then, of course, as you grow up, every time I've been back since, it's wonderful. It's incredible to be there. I have a completely different feeling. But also I'm going under my own aegis, right? I'm not going, dragged by my mother to meet 400 aunties. I'm going because I want to go and because I'm interested. And there's been an amazing piece of luck in my life. There's a great literary festival called Calabash, which happens very near where my mother is from. So it's kind of become a thing that I can do and, be home and also meet, people from the University of West Indies so all the bits of your life kind of come together in a way that's nice. It's a nice thing.
I assume you're the one doing the dragging now with your kids?
Yeah, there's a bit of, no one's been going anywhere recently, but I was meant to go in 2020 and then.
Great. So I won't be selfish anymore here, and we can, turn to the audience. If you all have questions for Zadie, she's gracious enough to accept them. Yeah, you can just raise your hand and somebody will, Leah, our brilliant marketing director here, will come to you with the microphone. Or Todd will. Equally brilliant.
Hello.
Hi.
Recently in my introduction to literature and cultural theory read a wonderful essay, Fascinated to Presume. And you read it in the context of translation, of James Baldwin, who you read Stranger in the Village. And it occurs to me that you said a moment ago that you don't have a particular theory or one central idea about what it means to read, what it means to write. But there's something about that essay, both I think because of the time in which the moment in which it was published, and its, finesse, its agility in moving from a defense of the imagination, almost in a Montaigne kind of way, and then call for, I don't know, I'd love to hear your thoughts about this, a kind of aesthetic that what matters in the end is, I think you said good writing. Could you comment a little bit about why you wrote the essay and maybe also what kind of reception you've gotten from it? It seems important to me.
Yeah, the most important part when I'm trying to write an essay is that I understand the attraction to binary arguments, but I am not an either or type of person. I am a and. So to me, the literary state of mind is being able to state two things simultaneously. That literally is the definition of fiction, really, for me. So there is not a contradiction in my mind between the idea of a human solidarity between all humans and the specific structural situations of individual communities. I don't find those things to be in contrast. It's more like a Venn diagram in which we have these separations and then we have this bit in the center. And any literary argument which says, we're all the same under the skin or whatever, immediately kind of allies into this kind of sentimental conception as if the differences don't matter. But to me, both things are true. We are both human and the differences matter. And I've just written a long introduction to this story of Toni Morrison's that's coming out in February. It's her only story, and it's really fascinating because it's a story of a little black girl and a little white girl, poor, in a state institution, who meet there. But throughout the story, and you see them grow up, you see them get married, you see them have kids, you never get to know who is black and who is white. It's a very deliberate and very brilliant story. And as you read it, you feel the absurdity of the concept of race and also its reality simultaneously. Perhaps fiction is the only place in which that can exist. It's not a reality, it is a fiction. But it's a legal fiction, apart from anything else, a societal fiction, and it has real consequences. So most people's brains explode when they have to consider those two things simultaneously. But in fiction, Morrison showed it is possible to do. It is possible to pay respect to the suffering and joy that has happened on both sides of this absurd binary that we have created, and also recognize that the binary has no essential existence because it does not.
I just had a quick question. What's the most compelling thing that you found in your research on 17th, 18th, and 19th century Jamaica?
I don't think I could choose one thing. Just how complicated the picture is, how much money is involved, that's pretty fascinating. And lots of painful things like Jamaica, I don't think, is a unique case, but because it's a capitalist system, there are plenty of examples in which I hadn't known about in 17th, 18th, 19th century of black people also owning, coming into land, owning slaves. It's a system of capital. So you really have to kind of get your brain around that, and that when people need money and need to make money, everybody is corrupted. The thing I find most about the Jamaican situation is its unbelievable obscenity. It's hard to describe what an absolute hell it was. I mean, not that I suppose it's surprising to anyone, but it is an unending hell, and just so interlinked with the beginning of the financial markets in England. It is a kind of basis of our financial system, and that's pretty interesting too.
Zadie, you mentioned that there was a silence surrounding this in England. In going back to Jamaica, do you find that history is being told there, in any way, shape, or form?
I'm sure it is in academic circles, but not really. I mean, but I don't know Jamaica that well. I'm a Londoner, an English person. My mother is the Jamaican. I'm not the Jamaican. But I would say the history is being reconstructed now. And they're incredible, like UCL in England has an incredible history department that has gone through all the plantation records and has a record of all the slaves. And there's incredible, actual research being done, which I'm benefiting from. But is it taught in English schools? No, not as far as I know. Not to my children. I've never seen it taught. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, thank you for your wonderful presentation. My question is, being so lucky of living in London, I think you were exposed to so many opportunities even though we were growing up in an under situation or financial situation. But I think living in London, or even living in England in general, you have so much opportunity to dig into the back and go back in history and literature, and for example, even just going to the Globe and having the presentation of the plays and all that. That's a full enrichment that I have, that I believe that the British kids are so lucky to have. The other thing is, I just want to congratulate you on being Jamaican, because living in London during the festival, the carnival, is fantastic with all the Jamaicans.
It's been cancelled 2 years in a row now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And my question is, you have mentioned racism at different levels of your conversation. Have you noticed a difference in racism in different colors? Let's say to brown
Difference in racism in...
racism in different colors. Let's say to black people, one racism. To brown people, another racism. To yellow people, another racism. Or is racism the same for everybody?
I really am not the expert on racism, on all the types of racism. But obviously, I was just reading a great piece in the LRB about, is it called Minor Feelings by Kathy Park Hong, about the very specific ways in which East Asian people in America are elided in this argument and find themselves kind of lost in a racial argument that there seems to have no place for them. So evidently that is the case. I think, what do I think? I mean, in England is all I can speak of, and I live in an area of constant immigration, right? So what you notice is the wheel is always being remade, and even like my own community, like old, fat Caribbean and Irish families in my neighborhood find ways to racially object to new arrivals of Africans or Bosnians or Poles. So, you know, it's amazing what can be achieved. New dimensions of racism, even from immigrants who should know better, to their newest arrivals. So yeah, the human capacity for this thing is infinite, it seems, yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. This is the first time I'm encountering you or any of your work, so I apologize if this is something you've already stated elsewhere. But I'm from Germany, I am German, and sometimes in the past I have struggled with owning that because that's not my DNA makeup. And when you said, I'm a Londoner, and you say it so proudly, I was just wondering if your history through teenage years, was it a struggle to own that, or have you just always...
I mean, London is in no way synonymous with whiteness, so it's very easy for Londoners to say they're Londoners. It's almost a definition, to be honest, at this point, of not being white. You know, I think it's very unhealthy for artists to extrapolate from their own case. The feeling of discomfort and anxiety and identity anxiety, which I absolutely understand citizens have and have every right to have, that feeling of discomfort is what made me a writer. It's creative to me. I don't hate it, is what I'm saying. Same as all the comedians and actors and other freaks that I know who feel they do not belong anywhere. I've never felt I really belonged anywhere or to anything. I don't mind that. But I absolutely understand that citizens want to belong. It's one of the most fundamental desires that they have. But I also sometimes want to claim the rights of writers to be whatever we are. I understand that we're weird, I get it, and not particularly socialized, and there's something wrong with us. I understand all of that. But that is, I mean, my childhood, in what way could I belong? I'm in a household of, you know, a very old man, a white man, a very young black woman. I don't look like either of them. What belonging could possibly exist in this household? So I come from a place of no permanent unbelonging. And the belonging I find in, you know, community, in friends, in artists, in what our community in Brent might not look like a community. It's everybody. But to us, it's a community. We are each other's brothers and sisters. We grew up with each other. I know how to make a chapati. I know when to break fast. You know, I can do a Polish prayer. That's how I grew up. So that is our community, where I come from. I absolutely understand that that is not in any way a model for general society. It's an unusual state, I suppose. But I have spent my career trying to suggest it is not a disastrous one, that it might even be quite an interesting one.
At the moment, I'm reading Maggie Nelson's On Freedom.
Yes.
Which she quotes you in a few times. And one of the reasons I'm really interested in Maggie Nelson and in your work is because it's very informed by academic frameworks or theories. But you yourself said that you're not an academic.
Evidently, we've seen that tonight.
And for myself, like in my own writing, I'm theories, but I don't have the background or the training or even the capacity to understand a lot of them. So I myself think of approaching things in a literary mindset.
Right.
As a writer first, always. Not by choice, but I think just that out of acceptance. So I'm interested in your relationship with when you approach your work. How do you bring in those frameworks? How do you bring in those academic theories?
I mean, I've just read Maggie's book too, and I just saw her, in fact, 2 days ago in California, and the gap between that kind of academic and prose and mine is very, very large, I think. I mean, honestly, in less agonized and revolutionary times, I don't think I would have written any essays. I've only written essays out of a sense of impatience sometimes, when I just have to, I spend 3 years listening to something discussed in ways that I find banal or annoying, and then I just write an essay. And then I'm disgusted with myself, because I don't like writing essays. I don't like the whole vibe. I don't like having to try and convince someone of something or having an argument, or that's not my thing. I'm interested in human beings, stories, fiction. My deepest identity in my mind, when I went to West Africa for the first time, was I want to be a griot. That's what I am. I want to tell stories, and they pass from person to person, and every time you hear one, you're like, oh, there's human life in that space. That's what I'm interested in. I've been forced to become an essay writer because of the times. It's like wartime or something, and you, out of duty, you're like, oh God, here comes an essay. But it's not something that I like to do. It's something that I felt I had to do because I just couldn't take it sometimes anymore. And I wanted to try and, so even with my students, trying to explain to them sometimes that you don't have to accept language as if it's fallen from heaven or been given to you by Moses on a tablet. Interrogate this language. What is it exactly? This latest literary theory or academic theory, is it actually true? Did you just write it out? Do you believe it? Does it mean something to you? Is there any other language you could use? Do you have local knowledge, particular knowledge that's to do with your community? Why are you taking this stuff as if it's from the gods? So every now and then, I find myself writing the essay, and then I'm sure, in response to the gentleman, a lot of people hate the essay. I'm like, what is she doing? Because when you're not speaking the language that everyone's speaking, you'll always sound insane. But what the hell? Everybody else is speaking it. Isn't there enough people speaking it? Can I speak something else? There should be a little gap for people to express themselves differently, no matter what the, what blowback. Luckily I don't have the phone, so I don't know the blowback. You can tell me about it later.
Run circles around academics, by the way. You just articulated what we all are trying to engage with in the present.
Oh, I'm glad.
So I am not a creative writer. I am an academic writer. So I would love for you to talk about craft for your creative writing. Just so I feel like academics very infrequently get to hear craft comments from people who are writing in a more creative realm.
I was just before I came here, Ruben caught me drinking a martini and eating some nachos and reading the New York Review, and I was reading a piece about Patricia Highsmith, and she kept 2 diaries. One of them kind of more in her front brain, I guess, thinking about things, but the other one was the creative one, and it's as she said, a lot of it is subconscious. She just didn't think about it too much when she was writing. When you're writing fiction, you just have to let go of the idea of knowing things, of being smart and being right and having the right argument, and all of that has to go. And sometimes it can be hard. In this novel, I was having a really good time until I got to Jamaica section. I know it's because of the weight of responsibility. All these dead people, all this suffering, all this misery. And so the temptation will be, I know it will be, to start theorizing, but the moment you do that, the novel dies. So it's a strange balance of what you think is responsibility. I must be politically responsible and write the correct thing. But if you do that, the novel will die. You have to let the novel live. And by doing that, in my view, and Toni Morrison is a good example of this, you do more justice to the ancestors, to the people you love, by letting them live. Letting them breathe and talk and say all the things that perhaps aren't the right thing to say or what would be said in an academic context, but you have to let go of that anxiety. Because the reader can sniff it in a second, they just smell it. Something's coming off the page and it's nothing to do anymore with the story, it's to do with your anxiety about what does this say about me, or does she have the right attitude towards 17th century Jamaican slavery? Or, once you've had that thought, the book is dead. It has died. So I think of a commitment to the characters and I try and just get out of the way. The most common feeling I'm having writing a historical novel is as you read history, you come up against so many inconvenient facts, particularly to the present. The present wants things a certain way. The reality is different. People died in this reality, so my commitment is to them, not to whatever version you want to believe happened 300 years ago. My commitment is to the actual reality of these people's lives, as mixed as it might be, as complicated as it might be, as unpleasant and hard to read as it often is. You have to keep faith there, because otherwise you've done something terrible. Of course, at the same time, you're always distorting history through your own eyes. Like, a historical novel written in 2021 is different from the one written in 1970 or 1964. Or, you can't help but do that. But I try as much as possible to let the past live, to keep myself out of it, and let my subconscious do its little thing.
You talked about sentences and punctuation. As you're writing, as the characters are building and all that, do you agonize over those as you're writing, or do you do that as you go back and look at what you're writing?
To me, that is writing. Yeah. That's it. It's the flow of time and energy through punctuation. And I really mean that when I think about like Baldwin compared to Morrison. The difference between them is not Harlem and Ohio. It's semicolons, dashes, full stops. It's the way Baldwin lets his energy flow compared to Morrison's, which is much more stately, almost scientific. She intellectualizes a lot. And Baldwin he's preaching, you know. That preacher part of him never left, and the sentences run on and semicolons go crazy. And I can always feel that difference. It's in the sentence. And that's the only way you have, to get a bit mystical about it, of preserving your energy on the page. I actually did meet Morrison briefly, but you feel you know these two people because of the rhythm that is left there. And maybe it's particularly true of black writing. I try not to get sentimental or essentialist about writing, but there is certainly a black tradition, and it is certainly involved with a rhythmic sense. And so these writers are particularly, to me, rhythmic, and the most important thing when I'm writing is rhythm. It's what I'm thinking about all the time. It's how I judge what I'm writing, and each novel I write, to me, apart from what's ostensibly about, it's about a different kind of rhythm, a different way of moving through a sentence, and so therefore a different way of forcing the reader to move through a sentence.
Does that carry into your essay writing as well? And I guess, you know, whether you meant to or not, the play that you wrote?
I think my essay writing is more narrow. I think there's a lot of Didion and Woolf in there just because I read them when I was young, and I was very desperate for women models, I think, when I was young. That is true. As much as I feel less anxious these days, when I was young I was really desperate to know there was such a thing as a lady intellectual. I really needed to know that, and it was hard to find. And like on my mother's shelves, like Angela Davis, Woolf, and Didion, and that really did. It helped a lot to know that was a thing, you know. And so I think some of my habits of speechifying or whatever in essays come from that trio, one way or another.
You're avoiding the play now.
Say again?
You're avoiding the play now. How about it?
I mean, Woolf, I can hear it, like she's in my head, I can hear it all the time. I think Didier is a great lesson in, if you want to show anger, the best way is not full caps and exclamation marks. There are other modes, let's put it that way. And that kind of controlled contempt that she has when she's really angry is something I took a lot from. And if you compare those pieces of Didier's to a lot of the stuff which was published at the time, which was often in caps with exclamation marks, you're not reading that anymore. You're still reading Didier. So it's a kind of lesson in how to control yourself. And in Angela Davis, just a great structural analysis, which at the same time wasn't dry to read. Like, it was kind of entertaining. So those are all useful lessons. But I think those kind of influences stuck harder to me in essay writing, yeah.
We've got time for one more question, so if you're...
Hello. I'm interested in questions of immigration and power, particularly with people coming and going into new spaces. And I really admired your story, the Embassy of
Cambodia, yeah.
And I was wondering, in relation to that story, just generally, how do you know when a piece is done? Like, when you got towards the end of that story, as you were going through the process, when did you feel like this is right?
That story is really, I don't usually have many good things to say about my fiction, but I think that is a good story, and I'm really proud of it. And it was really my mother's gift somehow. I don't know how she does these things, but I was trying to write something, and I remember not getting very far. I was thinking about Kafka a lot. And then she just came around one day with a newspaper, local newspaper, Brent News, by Kilburn Times maybe, with this story about a domestic slave on her street, just 15 doors up from my mum's house. I don't know why sometimes she has a second sense. She's a bit spooky that way. And she wasn't meaning why do you write about this? But it just came at the right moment. She handed me the paper, I was like, oh. Because I was kind of interested I've been reading a lot of Kafka, teaching Kafka. I was thinking about the power of those parables. I was wanting to write a parable about my neighborhood. I guess the thing that I always found worrying about immigrant narratives, having written quite a few of them, is it's really, really easy to read the story and you really empathize and you feel really sentimental and yeah, it was a great book and you read it with your book club and then you just, nothing happens, nothing changes inside you. It's it's too easy to empathize with or something. And there's always a very large sentimental part of it. And I thought, I just wanted distance. And Kafka's such a great example of getting to the human without sentimentalizing it, being at a distance from it. So, I think it came in my head with the idea of Fatu, and I guess memories of girls like that in my school who had just arrived, in my case, from wars in Somalia and Ethiopia in the 90s. And they had this incredible sense of self-containment, which in my mind, I suppose I thought of as a kind of defense to a very recent immigrant. You have to be careful. You're protecting yourself exactly from people's sentimental ideas. And so the story is kind of a reproduction of all that. How can you write about people protecting them from this kind of voyeuristic sentiment that surrounds you sometimes when you're in that situation? So she's very self-contained, the story is very self-contained, and the author is quite far away. And so once I had that feeling, it came quite easily, and it was really interesting to do. The other thing about it, which struck me, is it was a kind of lesson to myself compared to what I'd done previously, is allowing characters to be, even in their wrongness. So they're having a conversation at one point about genocide. They get all the facts wrong, and they're wrong about all kinds of things. But in my neighborhood, it's pretty common, right? You don't have a computer at home. It's really hard to do research. It's really hard to find out things. Knowledge is hard to get. You get it at the library. And I remember being that person who thought I knew things but didn't really know them and had the wrong facts. And part of writing fiction that really lives for me is writing fiction that is on its own terms. It's not looking out to the reader and checking or getting the reader's approval. So these are two people who have the wrong facts about the Holocaust, the wrong facts about the Rwandan genocide. They just don't know. But that's reality. Lots of people don't know things. And fiction is not meant to be a perfected space where everybody has the right opinions and says the right things and has the right ideas and knows the right stuff. So for me, it was like a principle. And I was glad of that story, because even now when I read it, she seems to be like a real person to me.
Well, on behalf of everyone here and all of those live streaming from home, I just want to thank you again, Zadie, for carving out time for us. And if you all can join me in thanking Zadie Smith. And there will be a book signing out in the foyer. If you just step outside, and books for sale there, so you all can purchase books. Please join us. And thank you, Zadie, for being gracious.